Hello. Tell me, what do you think of my Halloween costume? What? Cute. How dare you? This time of year brings out the darkest in all of us, so today we're going to look at the dark side of our heroic trio. The Nightmare Before Christmas is a personal favorite of mine that I watch every year around this time, and on Christmas if I'm honest. There's a perfect trio for us to use: lock, shock, and barrel. So get ready for some tricks. I'm sure you'll find it a real treat. And so here we have them. Martin, Madeline, and Shane as the iconic trick-or-treaters from Halloween Town. There's a lot of fan theories about how these three came about and why they ended up in Halloween Town. Most fans, including myself, seem to think many of the denizens probably died sometime in a past life, and that's how they wound up here in Halloween forms. They cite things like Locke's blue lips and pale complexion as signs of hypothermia, believing perhaps he froze to death. He was locked outside in the cold, either by accident or on purpose. This seems highly unlikely, though, since Locke's hands are still a peachy flesh color. If he'd really been frozen, his entire body would be blue, not just his face. Shock, as her name implies, was electrocuted, moved from fallen power lines. Usually this is supposed to be suggested to explain her blue hair that sticks out at every end in a wild style. But these are just stereotypical witch design choices. Lastly, Beryl, the skeleton. It's said he was trapped inside of an actual barrel and either suffocated or starved to death, forgotten. It's a reach, and to me feels a bit like an afterthought to justify their names. The names Lock, Shock, and Barrel come from the idiom of lock, stock, and barrel, a phrase used to mean all parts included. They're an inseparable trio, just like Martin, Madeline, and Shane. And to be honest, thinking of that is a lot of really grim ends for a group of kids, if you ask me. To be honest, I always just figured they were a trio of trick-or-treaters that happened to get lost one year, wound up in the hinterlands. You know, that circle of trees deep in the forest with all of the holiday doors painted on them. Well, upon seeing the Halloween Town door, of course they had to check it out, and perhaps they liked it so much they decided to stay. Under the corrupting influence of the malicious Oogie Boogie, becoming something far more sinister, minions in his devious plot to devour those who stand against him. Now, the rabbit hole that exists around the Nightmare Before Christmas fandom is pretty deep, but really quite fascinating. I'm not here to discuss it on this channel, though. We're an art and history channel. So while I'm doing the art, let's focus on some history. Namely, these three iconic costumes and what it all means. And let's start with Shock and get the most controversial of the three out of the way first. Shock is a witch, and she embodies some of the very typical witchy tropes, such as the pointy hat, scraggly hair, green skin, loud raspy voice. Despite Locke being the de facto leader of Boogie's trio, Shock isn't afraid to put him in his place and speak her mind, believing her intelligence superior to the other two. And there's likely something to that in why she was designed as a witch. So where does the look come from? Well, the green skin of the witch comes right from the Wizard of Oz and the Wicked Witch of the West. The term witch has strictly gendered origins until more modern times, such as with the religion of Wicca. It was only used for female and female-identifying people. Male witches were only known as magicians and sorcerers. The wild hair comes from an age-old propaganda about what your typical witch looked like and was. An old woman with a loud, piercing voice who did unnatural things just fly, and was associated with the devil. In this case, that devil is Locke. And when it comes down to the iconic hat, originally conical hats like what we see on witches were worn strictly by men of the Jewish faith. Sometime circa 1300s, this became a sign in continental Europe Italy and France specifically, of a Jewish person in a Christian nation where they were made to wear special items to be easily identified. Ugh. Anti-Semitism is just gross, like any form of bigotry, but it doesn't stop there. This same kind of religious persecution was not only used on medieval Jewish men, but also late medieval Quaker women. See, sometime in the mid to late 1600s, black conical hats were a huge fashion statement, but their use evolved into propaganda pictures and poems of Quaker women speaking up to men, consorting with devils, engaging in sex work, and basically anything that broke the traditional norms of England and her colonies, such as with the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, between 1692 and 1693. Witches were always depicted as women with some kind of job or profession such as weaving, ale brewing were most common. Actually, the persecution of women during these times was seen as a push for men in order to break into these businesses and take them over because they were so lucrative. And there's a lot of deep history into this one, and I'm going to do a lot more detail on that later for our Halloween special when we unveil a special talent, the Frost Coven. But for now, I'm going to move on to another classic Halloween costume as worn by Martin, the skeleton. Yeah, that's right. Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul and seal your doom tonight. But where do skeletons come from? Inside the body, of course. But no, animated human skeletons have been used as a personification of death in Western culture since the Middle Ages. A personification perhaps influenced by the Valley of Dry Bones in the Book of Ezekiel. The Grim Reaper is often depicted as a hooded skeleton holding a scythe, and occasionally an hourglass, which has been attributed to Hans Holbein the Younger in 1538. Death, as one of the biblical horsemen of the apocalypse, has been depicted as a skeleton riding a horse. The Triumph of Death in 1562 painting by Pieter Bruegel the Elder depicting an army of skeletons raiding a town and slaughtering its occupants. The story of the youth who went forth to learn what fear was is a Brothers Grimm fairy tale in which a boy named Hans joins a circle of dancing skeletons. In Japanese folklore, Mikurabe are rolling skulls with eyeballs who menace Taira no Kiyomori. Probably the most famous in more recent years are the skeletons seen during the Mexican celebration of Dia de los Muertos, where skulls symbolize life and their familiar circumstances that invite levity. Highly decorated sugar skull candy has become one of the most recognizable elements of the celebrations. They are known in Mexico as calacas, a Spanish-Mexican term simply meaning skeleton. The modern association between skeleton iconography and the Day of the Dead was inspired by La Calavera Catrina, a zinc etching created by Mexican cartoonist Jose Guadalupe Posada in 1910 and published posthumously in 1930. Initially a satire of Mexican women who were ashamed of their indigenous origins and dressed imitating the French style, wearing heavy makeup to make their skin look whiter. It later became a more general symbol of vanity. During the 20th century, the Catrina entrenched itself in the Mexican consciousness and became a national icon, often depicted in folk art. Countless cultures have used skeletons in their folkloric traditions for centuries, and in popular fiction such as, The Nightmare Before Christmas, One Piece, Terry Pratchett's Discworld, The Black Cauldron, and even antagonists in video games. One of them even has the most memeable theme song. But something that's been bugging me for years about Beryl is this. Is he dressed up just as your average run-of-the-mill skeleton? His mask doesn't seem like the ones used during Day of the Dead, so I surmise he's actually dressed up in homage to Halloween Town's King of Halloween, Jack Skellington himself. So last but not least, is Shane, or Locke? These costumes are messing me up, and look at Shane in red. Now that's something you don't see every day. We've already established a connection between witches or Quaker women and the devil, but what about beyond that? In Western media, Christian demons and devils often have a very specific appearance. You can usually spot them by their horns, bat-like wings, red skin, goatee, furred legs with hooved feet, and sometimes a trident or pitchfork. The horns and hooves are typically goat or ram-like, but bull-like examples also exists. Satan himself often takes this appearance. This trope has had a long evolution in its modern form. Many characteristics also have their own origin. The red skin seems to have started out as the red clothing worn by Mephistopheles in Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, in his guise as a cavalier. This is also the source of the beard of evil. The horns came as accessories to the older cloven hoof, which likely comes from Pan and the fauns and satyrs of classical mythology. Originally, the deformed feet were more varied: duck feet, rooster claws, and horses' hooves sometimes being featured. Bat wings were used to show that demons were fallen angels. Most of these characteristics are not found in representations of devils before the 13th century AD. Earlier visualizations of devils gave them dark or black skin, as in literally burned black by hellfire, which red-hot skin still connotates in a way. It's also one of the most popular colors for tieflings, arguably one of the most popular races in D&D, although I prefer the drow hexblade myself. Speaking of Mephistopheles and Faust, though, that kind of makes me wonder if Lock, Shock, and Barrel don't have some other origin. Could it be that perhaps they made some sort of bargain to wind up in Halloween Town? A group of 3 children who naively wanted it to be Halloween every day so they could never stop trick-or-treating, and were given that opportunity either by Oogie Boogie somehow, or perhaps Jack Skellington. And speaking of trick-or-treating, where does it come from? Actually, we can trace the practice of trick or treat all the way back to ancient Celts and early Roman Catholics, which means it's entirely possible that a celebration of this nature may have existed in Alden. Let's go into it. So the act of trick-or-treating has been a tradition in the United States and other countries for over a century. The first ever recorded event of what could be considered a modern event was in Canada, 1920. The origins before that point are murky at best, but can be identified in ancient Celtic festivals, early Roman Catholic holidays, medieval practices, and even British politics. Halloween has its roots in ancient pre-Christian Celtic festival of Samhain, or Samhain, which was celebrated in the night of October 31st. The Celts, who lived 2,000 years ago in the area that is now Ireland, the United Kingdom, and northern France, believe that the dead return to Earth on Samhain. On the sacred night, people gathered to light bonfires, offer sacrifices, and pay homage to the dead. During some Celtic celebrations of Samhain, villagers disguised themselves in costumes made of animal skins to drive away phantom visitors. Banquet tables were prepared with food that was left out to placate unwelcome spirits. In later centuries, people began dressing as ghosts, demons, and other malevolent creatures, performing antics in exchange for food and drink. This custom, known as mumming, dates back to the Middle Ages and is thought to be an antecedent of trick-or-treating. By the 9th century, Christianity had spread into Celtic lands, where it gradually blended with and supplanted older pagan rites. In 1000 Common Era, the Church designated November 2nd as All Souls' Day, a time for honoring the dead. Celebrations in England resembled Celtic commemorations of Samhain, complete with bonfires and masquerades. Poor people would visit the houses of wealthier families and receive pastries called soul cakes in exchange for a promise to pray for the souls of the homeowner's dead relatives. Known as souling, the practice was later taken up by children who would go door to door asking for gifts such as food, money, and ale. In Scotland and Ireland, young people took part in a tradition called guising, dressing up in costume and accepting offerings from various households. Rather than pledging to pray for the dead, they would sing a song, recite a poem, tell a joke, or perform another sort of trick before collecting the treat, which typically consisted of fruit, nuts, or coins. So, kind of like how caroling is used now. I wonder if there's a connection to there. But knowing all that, I'm certain that Shane makes an absolute killing on those nights. And, oh, God, are we really gonna do this? Oh boy. Guy Fawkes Night, also known as Bonfire Night. On this night, which commemorates the foiling of the Gunpowder Plot, in 1605, British children wore masks and carry effigies while begging for pennies. On November 5th, 1606, Fawkes was executed for his role in the Catholic-led conspiracy to blow up England's Parliament and remove King James I, a Protestant, from power. On the original Guy Fawkes Day, celebrated immediately after the famous plotter's execution, communal bonfires or bone fires were lit to burn effigies and the symbolic bones of the Catholic Pope. By the early 19th century, children bearing effigies of Fawkes were roaming the streets on the evening of November 5th, asking for a penny for the guy. Oh, the interesting origins and rabbit holes we dive into. Well, I guess, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. I bet you weren't predicting a link between Nightmare Before Christmas and V for Vendetta in this video, but that's just how the dice rolls, I suppose. In fact, the celebration of Guy Fawkes Day is the exact reason why we have trick-or-treating celebrations in the United States. The day was celebrated by many of the American colonists, and in the mid-19th century, large numbers of new immigrants, especially from those fleeing the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, helped popularize Halloween. In the early 20th century, Irish and Scottish communities revived the old world tradition of souling and guising in the United States. By the 1920s, however, pranks had become the Halloween activity of choice for rowdy young people. Now, the Great Depression exacerbated the problem, with Halloween itself often devolving into vandalism, physical assaults, and sporadic acts of violence. One theory suggests that excessive pranks on Halloween led to the widespread adoption of an organized, community-based trick-or-treating tradition in the 1930s. This trend was abruptly curtailed, however, with the outbreak of World War II, when sugar rationing meant there were few treats to hand out. At the height of the post-war baby boom, trick-or-treating reclaimed its place among the Halloween customs. It quickly became standard practice for millions of children in American cities and newly built suburbs. No longer constrained by sugar rationing, candy companies capitalized on the lucrative ritual, launching national advertising campaigns specifically aimed at Halloween. Today, Americans spend an estimated $3.1 billion on candy on Halloween, and probably twice that in dental bills. That's according to the National Retail Federation, and the day itself has become the nation's second largest commercial holiday, second only, you guessed it, Christmas. Oh wow, so that's a rabbit hole that went all over the place, didn't it? More like an ant colony or mole rats? I love Halloween, and I'll be going into more detail on Samhain as well as the origin of witches this year later in the month. For now, I hope you enjoyed this information and the Tim Burton throwback, one of the best Halloween and Christmas movies of all time. Thanks for tuning in this week. It means everything to us that you keep coming back. So if you appreciate this content, share it with your friends so they can like, subscribe, and ring my bell. I'd love to get a few more of you on the Patreon. So if you'd like to join Shadow Fox, Arya Gamari, Charles Tam, Jace Moreland, and Lunder Lumen, follow the Patreon link in the description. And if you're looking for an art commission, consider this week's artist, Kawabogbog. He's really quite good, with an easily adaptable and anime-esque cartoony style that's really affordable. Their link is down below as well. For now, that's going to be it for me. I've got to get ready for more folklore and pictures this month. So I'll see you next week.